ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country, around the world, and especially in Afghanistan and forward deployed in other places that folks may not be paying attention to right now. The guest for this episode is someone that was literally in my top 5 when I conceived of this show. He is a man I admire tremendously. I think is a conscience for our country, and in my limited interactions, a very good and cool human being. Someone I've been lucky to spend some time with, and I'm humbled to have on this program. I am very proud to welcome the great and powerful Admiral Mike Mullen to Independent Americans. Welcome, sir.
Great and powerful. Thanks.
Forever great
thanks,
and powerful.
Paul. It's really good to be with you. I'm not sure I'd use those descriptors, but it's good to see you again.
So I wanted to, before we get into a lot that I'm really thankful to have your perspective on, I was trying to think about the first time I actually met you in person. It's been maybe a decade and a half now.
Yeah.
And it may have been on a stage with Lady Gaga. There was an event in New York City where I was asked, and IVA was asked to bring like 100 veterans to stand on stage with Admiral Mike Mullen and Lady Gaga. Does that sound like it might have been the first time?
Well, I think you may have most of that right. That actually was at the Robin Hood Gala. It was right after the Bin Laden raid, and I had a few minutes on the stage with Tom Brokaw to talk about raising, but talk about looking at veterans and supporting veterans and the challenges that they had. And it was, I don't know, 4,500 people. I mean, some big number, and they raised a ridiculous amount of money, 47 million, as I remember, 11 of which was eventually raised to focus on veterans' needs. And I spoke with Brokaw about the veterans' needs that I was seeing, and I was still on active duty. So technically I couldn't really talk about raising money, but talking about, the needs very specifically. And then, so this is 2011, I think. And then for the entertainment later on was Lady Gaga, who came in, as I recall, in this big egg, and moved very slowly through this cavernous auditorium or convention center. It was down at Javits in New York, and then went to then be on stage. I didn't go with her to be on stage, so you may have conflated Lady Gaga, my presence, and yourself, and those 100 vets all in one place. But
that's
in a large sense, we were all in one place, but by and large, I wasn't on stage with her.
That sounds right. I trust your memory more than mine. I remember them being close together. Maybe you were off stage or near the stage. I remember the egg. She was carried through the Javits Center like Cleopatra in an egg.
Exactly.
And I've done a lot of veterans events, but that was not a hard ticket to get folks to show up for. But I think we may have also been introduced through my dear friend and mentor, Les Gelb, who I miss dearly. And I know you had a very close relationship with as well. And I especially miss him in times like these. But I think he put us in touch.
In fact, as I was thinking about engaging with you on this, I was thinking about Les today, because he's a mentor to many of us, and a dedicated public servant for decades who had some really remarkable ways to think about really difficult problems. And I know that he helped you a great deal in your instantiation as the head of IAVA, which I thought was a remarkable achievement on your part, and obviously still going strong from all I can see these many years later. But Les was one of the very special people.
Yeah, he was kind of the godfather of IAVA for a long time, helping us connect beyond the military community. I think he saw our potential as a generation, long before we did. And his spirit lives on in so many of us. And that if you go to Les's house, you probably went to his library in the back with Judy and the cats. And I would ask of all of our guests, where are you? because you're not, we're not on CNN. You're somewhere that has a very interesting background, and it's been a rough year and a half. The pandemic, so many other things. I ask all our guests, where are you and how are you?
I'm at home, where I've been for the past 18 months. In my office in my house, and this has got to be probably about the 1 millionth Zoom call I've been on. I mean, Zoom is great. It's also incredibly efficient just in terms of its ability to do back-to-back Zoom calls. And pretty much I've been here, the whole time. We're well. We're both fully vaccinated, and we've been fortunate. We haven't traveled much at all. In fact, I was talking with someone yesterday. I live in Annapolis, Maryland. It's a 40-minute ride to DC. I think in the last 18 months, I've been to DC 4 or 5 times in total. It just speaks to I think the world that we're living in. And I don't have to tell you or this audience what a challenge COVID has been, but we're also of age, my wife and myself, so we're trying to be very, very cautious about exposure. And we've also got 5 grandkids, soon going to have number 6, and we're concerned about making sure we can continue to see them. And obviously, they have a certain vulnerability in this environment as well. So we'd like to protect them as much as we can.
So one of the upsides of COVID is not having to go at least for me, not having to go to DC as often. And you've had your share of fun times in DC over the last few decades. Can I ask you? Most folks are listening, but some folks are watching. I see so many interesting things behind you. Can you tell us what's over your right shoulder that has an eagle head and what looks like some medals around the neck of it?
Yeah, there's just a couple medals there, actually. One of them is a distinguished graduate from the Naval Academy, and which when I was very young, nobody would have predicted that. And the other is actually a medal I received out in Los Angeles, which is where I'm originally from an outfit called the Jonathan Club. And what I like about that medal more than anything else, it's much less that they chose me to give me that award, but some of the people that I idolized when I was young, Johnny Wooden being one, were also previously recipients of that award and designation. So it's a little bit of home. It's a beach club I used to look at as a kid and say, I wonder who goes to that beach club, because I know I could never get in. So that's what that's there for.
Well, it's a good insight into your life journey, which has been an inspiration to me and so many others. You've been, I think, really a conscience for our country through some of the hardest times. We just recognized the 20th anniversary of 9/11.
Yeah.
Your entire existence has been so shaped by the last 20 years. 20 years after 9/11, sir, where are we as a nation? If you could kind of lay out the positioning of our country 20 years after 9/11, and what do you feel are the most important lessons that we have learned or should have learned in the last 20 years since 9/11?
Well, my reaction to what have we learned or what's happened in the last 20 years, we're as divided as I've ever seen it over the course of my life. And I'm a Vietnam kid. I mean, that was the first war I was involved in. To say I fought in it is a true statement, but I was on a destroyer off the gun line there for months, supporting Marines and soldiers ashore up by the DMZ. And that was a very difficult time for our country, for our military, in total. And I wore the scars. I wear the scars of that war as someone that went through, that generation. And it greatly affected me and how I saw my job, when I was in the chairman's job, and now we're back at war. So my life in the military sort of started with war and ended with war, sad to say. And in the latter half, in these last 20 years, I've just seen us divide in a way that I would not have thought possible, quite frankly. We were talking about COVID. So much of COVID now is politicized, and literally Americans are dying because of the politics, the divisive politics associated that are out there writ large, and in fact that are embedded in the COVID response. as was the case, throughout the pandemic, quite frankly, in my view. I mean, it's stunning to me that we've lost more than 650,000 Americans in this. For years, I watched this divide get created, and my thought was, when people would say, and I talk about the divide, and people would say, what's going to happen? What are we going to do about it? And I would say, we're crisis driven. I think that there will be some crisis which occurs, after which, or as a result of, we'll all come together, choose a leader that says, we're done with this and we're moving. And you would have thought 650,000 dead Americans would be that crisis, and we're not there. I mean, so that's the biggest worry. 10 years ago, I was asked what the number one threat to the country was, and what has become sort of a famous response, and I meant it at the time. Back then, it was our debt. And to remind, back then, it was $10 trillion, because I just couldn't see back in 2010 or 2011 how we were going to get out of that. And it's now, you do the numbers, but it's now, the debt is now at 28 or 29 or 30 trillion. I have no idea how your generation and your kids are going to pay for the future. I mean, because we just keep laying it on. So much so that now there are many, even there are conservative economists that are coming around to say, well, as long as the interest rates remain low, we can continue to do this. I just don't sign up to that. That said, when I get asked that question now about what's the number one threat, it's us. It really is us. It's ourselves. And we need leaders to pull us together and pull us out of this. And I think it's going to be a long haul to do that. If this crisis didn't do it, and it certainly hasn't. In fact, I would argue the pandemic has added to that. So I think that's what I worry about the most. Specifically, just sort of quickly from 9/11, and you and I and all of us went through it. This is a pretty tough weekend for me. I was in the building when the plane got hit. It actually flew in. I was out of my office down in the CNO's office, 50, 75 feet away from my office, but my two, up on the fourth deck of the Pentagon, my two EAs looked out the window, and saw a 757 fly in under their feet. And from that moment, I knew the world had changed forever. Without recounting, all of what happened that day, and those that we lost, which rightfully so, we remembered this weekend, and we should never forget those losses. But I knew right then the world changed forever. And I thought we had it right initially, honest. I thought going to Afghanistan, we had to go to Afghanistan. We had to go after bin Laden and Al Qaeda. And then where we got it wrong, from my perspective, was going into Iraq. And it became an incredible resource sump. It became a complete distraction, which took us away from Afghanistan. And I think that set the stage for long years of returning to Afghanistan, particularly under the Obama administration, which then got us to this position. The wars were too long. We stayed too long, and we got distracted. We didn't understand enough about the cultures and the history of those countries and of those regions. And I hope that we learn those lessons very specifically, because those cultures and that history is remarkable. There's a book. In fact, ironically, I'm teaching at Annapolis at the Naval Academy, and I'm teaching seniors specifically. And this week, literally tomorrow, one of the readings is from Tom Friedman's book, From Beirut to Jerusalem. And I can remember after we went into Iraq, maybe 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, something like that. If I came home one night and Deb had picked up this book, my wife, From Beirut to Jerusalem, which was one of Friedman's signature books. And we were just talking before dinner, and she hands me this book, and she looks at me and she goes, "Has anybody read this book? Does anybody have any idea what we're getting into here?" And that was a very instructive moment for me. It's why I'm having the kids at the Naval Academy read this tomorrow in my leadership class, because we don't do history well, and we're Americans, and we think we're always the good guys, and we always can win, and we don't need what happened, the last time to inform us, because it's our turn, our generation, and we'll figure it out. And so one of the lessons for me, for your generation and for your kids' generation, is when the time comes, please dust off the old lessons learned, on whatever the issues are, because they are valuable lessons, and you shouldn't have to relearn them all over again, as too often we do. And then the other lesson, and I think, Paul, you and I go back quite a way on this, the extraordinary generation of young men and women who served in these wars, Afghanistan and Iraq. And your leadership at IAVA is a great example of that. But actually, when people talk about the future, I still talk about the hope that gets generated tied to these young men and women that I saw die, that I saw get wounded, that I saw sacrifice everything for our country, and their cohorts. And so and a bunch of them are coming into Congress, and you've seen that as well. I think that is good and will continue to grow, hopefully, for our country. So that does give me hope in terms of the future of our country. I mean, those are some of the thoughts. I mean, we could go on forever just on 9/11 and what's happened in the last 20 years.
Your perspective is so unique and so vast around all of this. And there's a point that, first of all, I think I read Friedman's book when I was in a tent in Kuwait. It was like on my way. It was like my crash course. Okay, I'm going to read this as fast as I can before we head into Iraq, and so that's a reference point for me as well. But you mentioned a time of difficulty this last week, and it's been compounded by the events in Afghanistan that I think have been, frankly, a debacle over the last couple of weeks, and it's really created a level of stress in the veterans community and a level of sadness and just kind of breakage that I've never really seen before. And I think a lot of people in the community are hurt. They feel that the Afghans have been betrayed. They feel like our promise to the Afghans has been betrayed. And there's a question I want to ask you specifically, if I can. You're hearing a lot of the non-flag greats ask, who will be held accountable? 20 years later, there have been so many mistakes. Not a flag grade has been, at least publicly, really held accountable. Frankly, most of it's not directed at you, but often at others, and sometimes at you. What do you say about 20 years? We've learned lessons, but have we held anyone accountable for failure 20 years later, and specifically on Afghanistan? And will we specifically on the debacle of execution over the last few weeks?
So I was interviewed on this, I think, on this week. Martha Raddatz interviewed me a few weeks ago on this, and part of my response was, I'm responsible for a significant part of this. I mean, I was the senior military officer in the United States of America. I advised two presidents, specifically advised President Obama, on the surge, if you will, for Afghanistan. And my recommendation, and it was the best thinking I had at the time, that this was the right step to take. Still very, very complex situation. Some of that's obviously learning from Iraq. We're sort of in the counterinsurgency mode. That work there in 07, 08 timeframe to turn it around. And it seems like that was the right answer in Afghanistan. What I underestimated was degree of difficulty in Afghanistan, the history, as you fly around there. I mean, literally from one village to another, which is, next to each other, they've never even seen each other. I mean, it's a unique place in the world. And I was also instructed by, the book, The Graveyard of Empires, except there is sort of an American view of that as well. That was them, that's not us. That gets back to the hubris sometimes that we had, that in fact led us to that. And so it's hard to know that. I mean, as you've seen, I publicly spoke out and took responsibility, and there's not been many others that have done that, which is bothersome. again, back to these midshipmen that I'm teaching, I do teach them about accountability and responsibility, about owning up to your mistakes and your failures. And we all do and have, and I've had them in my career. So I'm driven by that. I have been surprised no one else has done that, and actually that doing that received a lot of comments back to me in support of what I've said, because it's so unusual for a leader to do that, sadly. So I don't know, I don't know for Afghanistan overall, I don't know that anybody's going to be specifically held to account per se. We get held to account, like it or not, in our reputation and our legacy, in what gets said and done and written about us over many, many years and decades, as the case might be. But specifically, I don't expect you're going to see anybody per se. And then fast forward to the end, and I agree that it was a debacle. I also sign up. First of all, it was time to go. Secondly, it just, to pick the 31st of August makes no sense. It just, you pick the Taliban at the height of their military capability any given year. Maybe it's not August 31st, but it's pretty close, in the dead of summer. Why we didn't pick a later date is beyond me. The dead of winter doesn't mean it wouldn't have been messy, but it could have been much better controlled. And yes, once we had everything sort of in place, the debacle or the disaster, when you get 124,000 people out, it's a significant accomplishment. But if you move it, particularly focused on those 13 young ones who died, and then if you move it to sort of a larger, how did we get here? We could have sequenced this thing a whole lot better. And it's easy for me, I'm now I'm an armchair quarterback, but at the same time, it just didn't make a lot of sense. And to execute it the way it was executed, per se, the size of the State Department footprint made no sense to me. I mean, it was 3,500 to 4,000 people, towards the end. I mean, a couple months before what I call Kabul Sunday. Huge footprint there. And I, like many others, I mean, literally, even as we speak, I'm still working to try to get some Afghan families, out of Afghanistan. Sorry about that, son. It keeps moving around.
Can we drill down on that for a second, sir? Because there's kind of a gaslighting or a shifting that's happening where the White House, and I think the president and Jake Sullivan and others specifically, keep talking about the numerator and not the denominator. This is how many we got out, but not talking about how many we left behind. Not a very high degree of candor from Biden, who's usually a humble guy who says, I made mistakes. They say no mistakes. This is how it was going to go anyway. And then I think even in this moment, to hear Jake Sullivan say, I'm trying to get people out too, to hear you as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, retired, say, I'm trying to get people out. I mean, this digital Dunkirk is inspiring, but it's happening because our government failed. And there's an outrage there that I think is asking who will have the honor or the accountability to hold someone accountable for that failure.
I think the question is a great question, and it needs to continue to be asked, because I think, back to the accountability piece, I think someone should be, and whether they will be is an open question. But I think for us to, as in all really bad circumstances, in order for us to heal and move forward, you need that accountability. So someone should, specifically. And in my case, I've been working in families now for 3.5 weeks or 4 weeks kind of thing. And I sensed, as I did maybe 3 or 4 days, before the 31st of August, the window was closing. As you know now, there are many up in Mazar. That window's closing. It's just my sense in my dealings. We're running out of time here. And honestly, one of the things, back to sort of every American now, Paul, the number I hear is 100. Is that 100 that wants to get out, or that's 100 Americans that are left there? I mean, to say that there would be 100 Americans that wanted to stay there wouldn't surprise me at all. But the tens of thousands, the additional You pick the number, 100,000 that helped us, that want to get out. I think that is our responsibility. And I don't know yet how we're going to do it. And I got a call yesterday or the day before from someone who actually is pretty close to this administration, who asked me a question. He said, do you know who the two presidents are that did this better than anybody else? And I said, no, I should, but I don't. He goes, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, because at the end of the Vietnam War, they opened up the floodgates and brought in 1 million Vietnamese to our country. And my editorial comment on that, on top of that, is look what great citizens they have become. Look what a significant part of the fabric of America they have become. So the risk is minimus. Is there risk there? Absolutely. But we need to do that. And that's what we haven't done. My own view is we're too carefully screening them. And that's really through the process, which I think is being run by State Department. It's not just them, because DHS is involved in this as well. And we've been too carefully screening them, from the get-go, with the exception, I think, of when HKIA opened up initially, right as the Taliban came into town, because they opened up the gates and just about anybody that wanted to get into HKIA and leave the country got in. After that, it's been tough screening that has really slowed and jammed the process.
So it's encouraging to hear your candor, because it's in such direct contrast to what we see coming out of the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House, some in the Senate. Senator Tim Kaine says, it's great that America's not at war for the first time in 20 years, while people continue to get combat pay and imminent danger pay. There's a contrast that seems stunning to me, to kind of paint a very different narrative. So we're gonna, I don't know what happened here. Like, either, in my view, either Jake Sullivan gave the president bad information, or the president didn't listen to him. I don't know if there's a middle ground in between, but it seems like that's the intersection of power in the chain of command, right? And someone there should be held accountable, because if they missed this by this much on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, what else are they going to miss?
Well, I think that's a fair question.
Right?
I think that's a fair question. I mean, it's very clear that, and maybe it goes back to the environment we're in. We're sort of where we started. We're living in a hyper political world. And so first out of the gate in solving this was 22 elections. Where are we at risk? And so how much of a hold, and who had a hold on this process as it affected that? When 75% of Americans want to get out of Afghanistan. And you've heard that over and over again, per se. One of the things I learned in the Obama administration, this is what I came to believe, is as politics got more and more partisan, which it did over decades now, the inability to let go of the political factors, political outcomes, and do what was substantively right, which I would argue in most cases would work well for you politically, it became more and more challenging. So hanging on to this, through the politics of it, I also suspect had a lot to do with, how we ended up. I'm talking to friends right now that think actually for the Democrats, that the 22 elections are lost as a result of this. Now, I don't know if there's a lot of time between now and.
But there's always a question of competence, right? You're responsible for the decision, but also the execution of the decision.
Absolutely.
Then candid conversations with the American people about, it's almost like watching two screens. You have the White House channel, and then you have the reality channel. And it feels like listening to George Bush in 2003 and 2004, when there was a White House story and a reality story. But as we pick all this apart, sir, and it can feel for folks like the national security world has our head spinning. And I try to keep our focus on that, asking people to stay vigilant about it. As we have this conversation, we're finding out how close did our country come to disaster in January. You've been in that chair. Everyone's talking about, what General Milley did, what General Milley didn't do. I don't know. I don't know if we'll ever know. But can you maybe, from your perspective, for the layman, how close did we come to something much worse? So I guess is a real question that I don't think people have heard from someone in your position who knows. You've been that guy talking to the president. How close did we come to something much, much worse during that time period that we need to learn from?
So much closer than I ever thought we would. How close actually, it's hard for me to know that. One of the ways, as difficult as those 4 years were on so many institutions, one of the ways I talk about it, Paul, is that the institutions held. The courts and the rule of law held in that situation and continue to hold as you look at the prosecutions and the cases against all those, so many of whom, hundreds who were on the Capitol that day. So it's, I don't know if I can say any better than that. It was a lot closer than I ever thought, but at the same time, I'm not sure, I don't think it was ever imminent per se. And actually, it's one of those things that had it happened, I've tried to imagine, well, what does that mean? What would we do? How would it be implemented? All those kinds of things, all of which would have had to have been put in place as well. So it was exceptionally dangerous, tragic loss. I think in particular I think it's 6 policemen that lost their lives, 6 or 7, one way or another, either killed themselves or died, kind of thing. The incredible sacrifice there. The video will never not be in my head of going into the Capitol. Taking on the very institution you claim you support, if you will. The proclamation of killing the vice president, the Speaker of the House, et cetera, the minority, all of those kinds of things. They're just things that I couldn't have imagined have ever happened or come close to being true. And it's a warning shot. It's a huge warning shot about where we are and the need, quite frankly, to clean it up from a political standpoint and bring the country back together. I don't want to get any further apart than we are. And that hopefully, that was a waypoint, if you will, that, that we won't get any further apart and that will somehow come together, although I don't know how that will be.
So we hope for that and we root for that and we fight for that. But as we do all that, the vaccine mandates are coming down that are going to drive a wedge. And the one in particular that I don't think got enough attention, and in my view, took too long, was a mandate for the military to get the vaccine, which still maybe 30% of the military isn't vaccinated, which to me seems like a force protection issue. I didn't have the option of not wearing my helmet when I went out on patrol, right? Yeah. When I worked for you from a very far distance, for folks to not have the option. Now, did the president, is this a national security failure for the president and the SecDef, Chairman Joint Chiefs, to not have vaccinated our forces sooner?
I don't think it's a national security failure, Paul. I think what's happened is they just put it in place over time. You saw this. You saw the secretary give what I would call a warning shots early. Hey, this is going to happen. They're now in effect executing it, and there's you and I were in the military. They're okay. What are you going to do with the ones who don't sign up? And won't do it, et cetera. And my answer to that is they're probably going to get processed, somehow. I'm not.
When did it become an option, sir? When you were in the military, I didn't have an option.
Oh, no.
I think things, right?
I think he could. I think it's a question of timing. I think he could have done it. He could have done it on day one. Right. This is what they chose to do, for whatever reason. And it is to some degree in conjunction with, the rest of the mandates that are coming. It's also back to, where does this go? Someone said the other day, and I thought, hey, we're going to get to the point where you're either vaccinated or you have COVID, basically, which is a pretty sad state from my perspective.
Yeah. And maybe, would have been a dream for Osama bin Laden to see.
Well, somebody said,
to see this many Americans die, to see insurrectionists taking the Capitol, to see our allies mistrusting us, to see people who stood with us abandoned. In many ways, 20 years later, a lot of this has our enemies celebrating. And let me ask you this, sir, as we think about the division, which I think you rightfully identify as a key threat, and domestic extremism is a key, if not the number one national security threat, we try to find solutions to this division. Right. And this show is called Independent Americans. A lot of folks are unaffiliated. They're politically independent. They're rejecting both parties. It was reported that you would have been Mike Bloomberg's selection for vice president if he ran as an independent. Would you ever go for office again? And if you would, would you align with either of these parties? Where is the future for folks like us? We look to someone like you that, frankly, if you stood up and said, I'm starting the independent movement that rejects the parties and puts country first, we end up with Howard Schultz or someone else. But there are a lot of folks like you that have been on the sidelines, apolitical, that we want to pull in. So is there a future that you can lead or be a part of that is politically independent and necessary in this urgent time?
I don't think so. That's me. I mean, part of it for me in going through that process with Bloomberg was, finding out it's a blinding flash into the obvious, but if you haven't been in it, it's much less about doing the job than it is going through the gauntlet to get to it. I mean, which is extreme. And that's not all bad. I mean, this is not an insignificant job. That's one piece. Secondly, the parties have locked this up into a two-party system over, decades and decades and decades. So the idea that a third party could come in, which has happened before, and it's seemingly each time it does, it undoes one candidate with respect to the future. Bush 41 would be a great example with H. Ross Perot, but others, it's the same kind of thing. And the parties are so powerful, so structured. And if you are not of them, that they will not literally, but they will kill you per se, no matter who you are, because you threaten their very existence. So the answer I'm giving you is it's pretty discouraging. I think it has to come, sadly, from within that group. There've been, I was talked to not too long after I retired, actually, before the Bloomberg thing, talked about being involved in another group that was looking at a third party. It just, it's like the parties sense it's out there and they just move in every direction to kill it. The competition. It would just have to be such a groundswell. I mean, I would love to do it in terms of the independence, in terms of the skill set, in terms of the, helping the country, that kind of thing. I don't see a path. One, two is, and I've talked about this with others, it's not us. Somebody with my background, when I think about, or what I've seen in the political world, that's not me. It would cause me, I believe, to become someone that I'd never want to become because of the requirements of the political world. I'm trying not to cop out here. It's just what I've learned and seen. So I wouldn't slam the door on it. I just don't know where the door is.
Well, I think you and I have had informal conversations about this in the past. I think it has to start with a couple of key leaders and a strategy, right? Yeah. There needs to be somebody who pulls a strategy off the shelf with the right goals, the right resources, the right leaders. And if you and Mike Bloomberg and Colin Powell and pick 10 other, transformative figures that have the resources and power said, okay, we're putting country first right now and trying to disrupt this for the sake of our government. I think, George Washington warned us against the parties. And now we're seeing it come full together. So I'm going to root for, I wish there are plenty of times in the last couple of decades where I wish you were president, or I wish someone like you were president, because the person who doesn't want it is the person we often need, especially in these times. But
you flatter me, Paul. Believe me, I understand what you're saying. I certainly wish there was a cadre of leadership taking the country to a different place. And I'm not just talking about right now. I'm talking about over a long period of time.
Well, you're a true keeper of the American flame. Well, and I promised you I'd let you go. If you have a couple minutes afterward to stick around for rapid fire for our members, I'd love to get your thoughts on those. But maybe a final request of you, sir. A lot of folks are going through hard times.
Yeah.
They feel hopeless. They feel frustrated. You have been a North Star for many of us that know to listen for your words and look for your words. But for the folks who maybe haven't heard from you, what's your message to them? You're not president, but you're in my view, one of the most important leaders of our time. What is your message for those folks who are grinding through it right now and maybe really struggling?
So one of the things I learned as a sailor, about ground combat was in these formations we call brigades, but really right down to the platoon level, is is usually at that level, we knew who was going to struggle when they left, when they got home, et cetera. And one of the things I've encouraged young, mostly young, certainly younger than me, young people to do is to stay in touch with your buddies from the fight. Really key. And we have a tendency to come home and the structure that's there, the camaraderie that's there, the things that we loved, whether we thought we loved them or not, and all of a sudden they're gone and you're by yourself and you don't have any support and you can't have any conversations with anybody that really understands what you went through. I mean, that piece of it. So I have encouraged for years individuals who are struggling like this, but others who know that others will struggle, or that they're in touch with each other often enough to pick them up, to remind them who they are, that they have a future, that they did good things, that we need you for the future, those kinds of things. So reaching out to them, I think, and to each other, with that common bond and camaraderie to remember it by, I think is really key. And it's one of the things that, back to IAVA, it's one of the things that IAVA does, et cetera. But better than I mean, we're at an all-time high for suicides in the country, as well as in the military, as well as in the veteran space. We need to stay in touch, to intervene ahead of time before somebody takes that tragic step, if you will. So that's one of the things that's one of the ways that I think about, what to do in this very painful time. And quite frankly, this last weekend was very painful for me for lots of reasons. I can still remember the voicemail I got from my younger son as he was in tears, leaving a voicemail for me saying, you better pick up on this line, because he didn't know whether I was dead or alive based on what happened at the Pentagon. So I certainly don't equate that to losing anybody and the tragedy that families went through that day in that regard. But this, the recent times, and I think you have it right, this combination of the Afghanistan withdrawal and 9/11 at the 20th years has been a really, really difficult time for many people. And others should recognize that and not just assume it was another weekend or another couple of weeks, and make sure they're checking on their buddies.
Your humility, your patriotism, your candor, the way you've opened up is an example of what a role model should be in this country. We say all the time, like Mr. Rogers used to say, look for the helpers. You've been a helper for a long time. And I know you're a grandfather now. I know you're retired, but the country is going to need you now more than ever. And I'm grateful that you've spent this time with us and for all that you've done, much of which we will never know about. On behalf of all of us, sir, thank you for all that you've done for us, and thank you for joining me. It's been a humbling honor to have you here with me on the show.
Thanks, Paul. It's been really good to be with you.
Stay vigilant, sir.
Yeah.